Cool. Okay, so again, touring Omaha's prettiest mile. Here we go. The first thing that I want to start off with before we get going is this very open-ended Q&A. Any questions, ask away. I invite you right now at Mt Olive, take a minute and share your questions with the person sitting at the computer, and let's put those into the chat so we can see them. Max, feel free to shout out loud or type into the chat, either way. What questions do you have before we even get started about the history of Florence Boulevard? Anybody? We are going to do another Q&A at the end. So if you get questions as we go along, grab onto them and go ahead.
Was the boulevard part of the interconnection system between many parks in Omaha?
All right, we're going to get to that one. And it's a great question, Max. So Omaha has what's called a boulevard system. Let me just say this right now. The boulevard system was designed early in the city's history, and I'm going to dive into that in just a moment. But the Florence Boulevard was not just a part of the city's boulevard system, but perhaps even the main element of the city's boulevard system. Mt Olive asked, can I make my picture bigger? Which picture, my big floating head or the picture on the slide? Mt Olive dropped that question or that answer in there for me. The Q&A, yeah, the slide itself. The answer is no. This slide is what it is. However, and again, I'll be posting this online so you'll be able to look more. I also invite you to take a look when you get back to your computer to take a look at the history of Florence Boulevard, where a lot of these photos are. So you'll be able to zoom into them there. What we're looking at right here, this particular picture, is the very first mention of Omaha's prettiest mile. And that's why I put that right here on this slide. What we see is entitled Rome Miller's Residence, and we're going to dive into that in just a moment. But off the top of their head, does anybody know where Rome Miller's residence is? Nobody? All right, we're going to get there. Remember, hold your questions or type them into the chat, and we'll get them as we go along. All right. So the instigator, the person behind the vision of Florence Boulevard. Florence Boulevard has a history that goes back to the 1840s, but it's best to start with this man's recollection. His name was Horace Cleveland, and Horace Cleveland was a nationwide, nationally renowned designer of public spaces. He designed parks, he designed cemeteries, but in Omaha, he's most well known for designing both parks and the boulevard system that Max mentioned. Omaha's boulevard system was originally designed in the 1890s. And actually in 1892, Horace Cleveland submitted his designs for the entire system. He wanted it to feel like an extension of a park that a person could ride through on their horse and buggy. Because the boulevard system wasn't designed for your beautiful car. It wasn't designed for your old-fashioned car. It wasn't even designed for l'automobile, the humpmobile, or whatever it was you were driving around back in the olden days in 1910 or 1905 or whatever it was that cars first hit Omaha streets, which were actually 1900. But you get the idea. It wasn't designed for that. Instead, it was designed to take your horse and buggy and be able to make a loop around the entire city and even on the outskirts of the city at some points. So when you think of Florence Boulevard, some of you might know the actual answer to this, but when you think of Florence Boulevard, where do you think of it beginning? I'm going to show the exact route in just a few minutes. But technically speaking, Florence Boulevard starts all the way down at Cass Street, and it's co-named with North 19th. It jogs and then takes its form as we know it, Florence Boulevard itself, just south of Kuntz Park, and then it extends all the way up to Ames Avenue. When Horace Cleveland designed it, the boulevard began at Ames Avenue, went all the way north up to J.J. Pershing Drive. Remember that Omaha had this hodgepodge of roads that were all over the place. 1892, when Cleveland submitted his designs, there was no Fontenelle Boulevard yet, as we know it, to extend all the way over to Reddick. There was no Martin Avenue. No pieces like that. However, Fontenelle Boulevard was put in according to Cleveland's vision. Now, what makes Fontenelle Boulevard common with, what does it have in common with Florence Boulevard? They both abutted, originally, major parks. And if you don't think of Florence Boulevard abutting a major park, you're not remembering Miller Park. Show of hands in Mt Olive. Does anybody live on Florence Boulevard? Can I see hands? Do you live on Florence Boulevard? One? All right. So there is a jog on Florence Boulevard that goes from the boulevard as we know it over to 24th Street, and originally went onto a roadway in Miller Park to weave around the park. And that was according to Cleveland's vision. Fontenelle Boulevard does a similar thing when it goes through Fontenelle Park. See, both of these parks were designed to be major jewels of Omaha's park system. And if you think of them today, they both sit that way. Other boulevards were part of the system as well, all the way down to Turner Boulevard, Deer Park Boulevard, other elements in South Omaha. Lincoln Boulevard was an important part that was in North Omaha that was obliterated to make room for the North Freeway and I-480. However, there are pieces of Lincoln Boulevard that still exist today. And of course, Florence Boulevard connects it all back together. When Horace Cleveland first designed the boulevard, his full intention was to make a street that was completely devoid of railroad tracks. And so he looked at an old map of Omaha, maybe even the one that's right in front of you. This is a clipping from an 1856 map. And he said, now that would make an excellent pathway north. And what was he referring to when he said that? If you look really close on this image, you can see a line going up and down with some cursive writing on it. Well, nearly cursive. It's a fancy font anyway. That says Winter Quarters Road. And if you've attended other presentations, you know that Winter Quarters is the original name of the Florence neighborhood. Winter Quarters was established in 1846, and the Winter Quarters Road went from the Mormon South River crossing down by the South Omaha Bridge, and it went all the way north up to Winter Quarters. Now, that road went along a cliff, and that cliff extended through downtown Omaha, but it was as far south as the old Riverside Park, which is now called Henry Dorley Zoo. So this road went along that whole cliff. There were no interstates, there were no dives, or there were a few ravines, but there were ways to get around them. And that road went all the way north, all the way up to Ames Avenue, and beyond, all the way up to Reed Street, all the way up to J.J. Pershing Drive. But it was originally the Winter Quarters Road from 1846. That's the roots of Florence Boulevard. Now, I made this map. It's a little crude. I hope you'll forgive me. But I wanted to show us specifically what the developers were talking about when they talked about the prettiest mile in Omaha. Hint, hint, it was not from Arthur Store's Expressway North, even though that's how we might think of it today. We might think of the island in the middle of the boulevard as being the starting point of the prettiest mile. But developers thought of it starting with Rome Miller's house, and even south of that, all the way at Ames Avenue. Adam, all the way at Ames Avenue? Well, that's not pretty. Pshaw. We're about to see some pretty houses. But Rome Miller's house was one of them. And it sits right at the junction of Florence Boulevard and Horseshoe Bend. See, I'm imagining all of the gasps in the room there at Mount Olive every time that I make one of these grand conclusions. So if I wait for a oh, I'm just gonna kind of fill it in my own imagination. Play along with me. It's more fun that way. Ooh, we got some chats in the chat. Okay, Mount Olive. Pipe it in there. Keep going. Check this out. Here's a timeline. I just made this because I want us to help. I want to help us think about the actual timeline of what we're saying and doing here. I want to talk about the pioneers. These are kind of the top line there, are kind of the eras of Florence Boulevard's history. And again, these are arbitrary. I just made them up. But the eras are the pioneers, the acreages, the developers, the suburbanites, the residents, and the future. Now, inside of those eras are these four major events. The layout of the boulevard, which I pinned down from the 1840s when it was first laid down as Winter Quarter Road, all the way into the 1890s when Horace Cleveland officially laid it out and designed it as part of Omaha's boulevard plan. The acreages, the first houses on Florence Boulevard were not small houses. They were acreages that were established, some with as few as 3 acres, some with as much as 20 acres. These were fine houses built along a cliff overlooking the Missouri River Valley. They need acreages so that they could have paddocks for their horses, maybe a little farmstead. But wait, Adam, when I think about Florence Boulevard, I don't see enough room for that. Well, think about the houses that were built after the 1920s. You can kind of envision those, the cracker box houses, the newer ones. But I bet you can also imagine that just to the east of the cliff, because that's what's behind Florence Boulevard, you know that, right? There's a cliff where it drops off. There's those big wide open areas down there. Now, some of that land became trailer parks, and that some of it later on became industrial, but a lot of it was farming. And it wasn't farming for farmers who lived down in East Omaha, quote unquote. It was farms for the houses that were up on the boulevard. People went from their house up on the boulevard to their farms down in the bottoms, because that's what that land was called. Anyhow, those acreages lasted from the 1870s through the 1920s. In the 1910s began the beautification effort, and that lasted into the 1960s. But all was not lost in the 1960s. We know that because you might have driven down the boulevard to get to church today. You might drive down the boulevard when we're done. And some of it is still really beautiful. Current times from the 50s to the present. But what were these schemes? What were these plans, these ideas to make Omaha's prettiest mile? Well, folks, here are some early ads from 1910 through 1912. The one on the left says, you can live on the prettiest mile in Omaha by buying a lot in Norwood. Wait a second, Adam. Norwood? Get ready. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Omaha's prettiest mile, on Omaha's prettiest mile. It's so nice you have to say it thrice. Deal with the owner, save commission, phone Harney 5692. This person was selling a strictly modern home, oak finished 6 rooms, besides the bath, den, and storm-proof sleeping porch. You had to have a storm-proof sleeping porch because you didn't have air conditioning. Has a large living room of 11 by 23, colonnade opening to the dining room of 11 by 14, a neat den or sewing room, and a handy kitchen with built-in features. It had a large refrigerator room. Don't forget that refrigerator room, because you didn't own a refrigerator, you owned a whole closet where you kept your ice to keep all your stuff refrigerated. It was lined with special stuff, maybe lead. Anyhow, 3 good bedrooms, 4 closets, tiled bath and sleeping porch on the 2nd floor, stairway to the storeroom in the attic, a full cement basement with floor drains, fruit cellar, and enclosed coal bin. Furnace heat, complete with screened storm windows, gas heater, water meter, and window shades, decorated throughout. Large lot on paved street and easily worth $1,250. This property is actually worth $4,500, but we want to sell it quick, and we'll make the price $39.75. That's $375 cash and a balance of $30 monthly. Good lot. Taken as part pay. Oh, wait, Adam, are you telling me that I could have bought a house on Florence Boulevard in 1912 for $39.75? That's $3,975. And the answer is yes. They weren't cheap. The other ad on the far right, beautiful new home, 3 acres of ground, price $9,000. Holy moly. That was the high end. That was 1914 when that ad came out. So you could see this energy, but check this out. It gets better. Look at these bad boys. Woo! Parkwood, Omaha's latest subdivision. You see, the most beautiful mile in Omaha, the prettiest mile in Omaha, had two names. One name for the subdevelopment was Parkwood, and Parkwood extended from Reddick Avenue all the way north to Reed Street. See that in your mind's eye? See it on the map right here? The houses abutted 24th, and they went not to the cliff, but even down, and you could see those lots extending all the way east, down the cliff onto that east side. The ad on the right talks about Norwood. Some of the advantages and attractions of this edition included all large lots, remarkably low prices, beautiful surroundings, natural advantages, fine shade trees, building restrictions, no stores or saloons, park frontage, boulevard frontage, broad cement walks. The prettiest mile of Omaha's boulevard system runs through the heart of Norwood, and in Norwood, it is from 120 to 150 feet wide and beautifully parked. They turned parked into an adjective. The best proposition for either home or speculation offered today. Think of it, only $708.75 for fine lots in this high-class edition will absolutely double in value. 9 months ago, Norwood was a cornfield. Today, it's a fine residence district with fine homes being built and all improvements in. Only 21 lots were unsold. Don't put it off. See this ground today. Woo-wee. It's the hard sell by Norris and Martin. You can see that Norris was involved in selling a lot of this. We're going to mention his name again in just a little while. But Norwood and Parkwood, two different subdivisions along the prettiest mile in Omaha. Now I can hear the questions percolating in your minds. Feel free to dump those right into the chat. I'm checking out the chat right now. Jody, I'm glad that you live in Norwood. We could see the interest building. Watch this. Some notable addresses. Now, these are, I'm going to be honest, guys, these are arbitrary. I reached in and I pulled them out of some different spreadsheets that I have. The city of Omaha and the state of Nebraska have conducted historical surveys of the most beautiful mile, and I'm going to talk about those in just a little while. But these are addresses from their collection. So if your house is missing and should be on the list, drop it in the chat. Let's see it. But I'm just going to pop through a few of these addresses because some of them will be super familiar to you and some of them might not be at all. The McGran and Gillette Slatter House at 4802 Florence Boulevard. The Martin House at 4811. Now, these are south. These are down by Ames. The Roe Miller House we talked about. The site of the Stroud Mansion. What is this, Adam? Oh, we're going to talk about it more specifically in just a moment. 5815 Florence Boulevard and 5833, both built in the 1910s. The Burke Wood House at 6129 Florence Boulevard. We go further north into the Gustafson Natter House at 6140. The Brenner Dennison House, you might be familiar with this gigantic old rectory. He was the rector. Oh, wait, I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. 6141 Florence Boulevard. The Fort Omaha House. Today it's called the Omaha History Farm at 6327 Florence Boulevard. The Litz House at 6453 Florence Boulevard. The Riff House at 6531. The Westbrook House at 6532. Are there others? Again, make sure you're dropping them into the chat. Let me see them. Let's take a look at some of these houses specifically. The Martin House, the Miller House, the Stroud Mansion. We're going to look at a few others. Let's start with the Martin House. Now, this one might pique your mind's eye. Built in 1924 by Charles Martin. You might be familiar with Charles Martin's name. Charles Martin was the developer behind the Mt Historic District. He was also the developer behind the Florence Field District, which you know as the home of Mt Olive Church. We can see, oh, Jody, we have some information here in the chat. Jody says her house was built in 1912. It has a tunnel under it that crossed to the old rectory. We're going to talk about those in a minute. Jody's last name is Gustafson. Dun, dun, dun. So the question again, oh, I don't know. What was the question? I'm sure it was a good one. It was to the effect of, what houses need to be mentioned that aren't? But let's take a look here at the Martin House. So the Martin House, you might be familiar when you go along Florence Boulevard, north of Ames, there's a little park. And it has one sign that says Bluff View Park. And next to that one sign, there's a trash can. And that is the only sign that is actually a park. Bluff View Park was installed in the 1900s, right after the turn of the century, right after the turn of the 20th century, to commemorate the 1898 Trans-Mississippian International Exposition. They were supposed to make a fine park along Florence Boulevard, and they didn't do it on time, but they did put that Bluffview Park there, and nothing was ever done to develop that park. However, houses were built near it, and in 1924, Charles Martin, the developer of Mt and Florence Field, built his family this home. Colonial Revival style. Notice that that's a little bit different from anything that you see in Mt or Florence Field. Notice those columns, that Monticello entrance, that rounded porch cover, whatever the right architecture words are for it. It's beautiful. It's still standing and it's waiting for you to go drive by it and take a look. But the important thing to know is that there's a stable that's behind that house, and the stable is still standing. And the stable was originally for a mansion down the street that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. But it predates the house by at least 25 years. Oh, let's take a look at the old rectory. Notice that I accidentally left the template language in here, so please ignore that. But the old rectory is at 6141 Florence Boulevard. This house was built in the very first part of the century. Jody, maybe you know the exact date. But it has a little bit, yes, well, a little bit of interesting history, or maybe a lot. For a long time, this house was the rectory for Blessed Sacrament. It's where the priest lived. Before that, it had some different history. There's a loving family who cares for it very much, and we're going to hear about that in just a little while. But back in the olden days, in 1919, oh, come on, I'm getting some good stuff in the chat, but I need some more information. Keep going if you want to fill that in. See, this is the part where it'd be fun to listen to Mt Olive, but I can read pretty well. Okay, so here we're going to get into it. So Mt Olive, you just typed in the bootleg house, and I'm going to tell you about 1919. There was a man who lived in this house. He bought the house for his young wife who was at least 50 years younger than him. He was an old guy at that point, and his name, well, I'm going to tell you his name in a minute. But this old guy, he was, well, for lack of a better word, he was called a political boss by some people. He's called a crime boss because he actually controlled the crime and the politics in Omaha. His name was Tom Dennison. They called him the Old Gray Wolf. And the Old Gray Wolf married a young woman in 1918. And he bought her this fine house. He was madly in love with her. But she passed away suddenly in 1921. And he was heartbroken. He stayed in the house for one more year and then he moved out. The house went into regular house ownership and all the stuff after that. But for the brief window, Tom Dennison, Omaha's political and crime boss, lived right on the prettiest mile in Omaha. Because it was a fine address. in a fine district, and people thought very well of it. And so it did good for this crime boss to be associated because he was trying to look legit. So he bought in. Later on, it became the old rectory. Later on, it had all these other lives. Oh, but those tunnels, we're going to get to those in a minute. Here's the Rome Miller house. Now, you might not recognize this because it's a black and white photo, but if you drive by it right now, it's a cream-colored house. It's right by the Horseshoe Bend. It was built in 1898. This man, Rome Miller, was a hotel magnate because in 1898, if you owned 7 motels, you were a magnate. You were big time. This is long before Sheraton and Hilton and all the fancy big brands. But when Rome Miller built his house, he was the top of the pops. Now, remember, he didn't build a house in North Omaha. That wasn't what he was doing. He built a house overlooking the Missouri River Valley in a fine spread of land out from underneath him. And that view out of the back window of the house looked out over the whole valley back then. Now, today he has a great view of the Nighthawks Cafe, which counts for something. But back then he could see Carter Lake, he could see the river, he could see the farm spreading out. Now the trees have grown in, so maybe it's a little different, but the house is still in spectacular condition. That stable that I mentioned earlier was down the street from this house because this house had a gigantic estate attached to it. If you look in East Omaha, i.e. down the hill at the end of Dead Man's Curve, you'll notice that all those houses are a little bit newer. They're all from the 1920s through the 1950s. That's because it was during that point that land became disassociated from this house. But the house still stands today and it's in great condition because the people who live there have taken really good care of it. Now let's look at some fun facts about Prettiest Mile. Those are all the house features that I'm really going to dig into. So I expect some more questions. But I think it's fun that Prettiest Mile had its own golf club. This was a social group of women only who met all the time from 1914 until at least 1970. Now, you might become familiar with the institution that they ended up building that still stands today, or at least the bones of it do. Anybody know the name of the institution that they were very influential in getting built? All right, take your mind's eye and travel down Reddick Avenue. Ah, there we go. Good job. Take your mind's eye, travel down Reddick Avenue, stop at Mt Olive Boulevard. Look in the northeast corner. Today we call it the Viking Ship. It's a nonprofit community center that operates as a nonprofit. Once it was called the Birchwood Club. It was renovated to look like today's Viking Ship in the 1950s. But before that, originally it was called the Prettiest Mile Club. And the Prettiest Mile Club was built by Charles Martin as part of his Minnelusa housing development. It was originally built in a Spanish colonial revival style. I've got a whole article on it on NorthOmahaHistory.com. Just go take a look at it. It's cool. And what park did the Prettiest Mile Golf Club love? Miller Park. And they used it more than anybody. At one point, the club had 380 members. In 1918, so almost a decade after it got to building up, Florence Boulevard, 20 specific homes were designated to be rented to officers' families from Fort Omaha for the war effort. The Great War was underway. Nebraska and the United States had entered the war. Soldiers were leaving Fort Omaha every day as part of the Fort Omaha Balloon School and the Signal Corps to go fight overseas. Their families needed places to live, and they lived on the boulevard. Finally, this is a fun fact. I think it's phenomenal. You can find on NorthOmahaHistory.com an article about the Overland Airlines started by Roy Furstenberg. Good old Roy in 1926 he built the first commercial airplane in Omaha, Nebraska for a company that he called the Prettiest Mile Airways. Eventually, they ended up moving the company over to Carter Lake at the back end of the old municipal airport. What? You didn't know that the municipal airport used to be on Lindenberg Drive? Well, surely that's where it originally was. Furstenberg built his commercial airplane hangar in a new space that the city had just designated as part of the airport that today holds the parking garages at Epley. And that's where Prettiest Mile Airways was before it changed its name to Overton Airways. But Furstenberg named it for the Prettiest Mile Boulevard because his house was there and he could see his original airfield, which was not out by Epley. His original airfield was at North 16th and Reed Street. And Furstenberg could literally see it from his window because that's where one of Omaha's first airports was, at the end of 16th Street. Dun, dun, dun. Those are some fun facts about the Prettiest Mile. Now let's take a minute and watch this news report from a few years ago.
Omaha homes will be on tour this Sunday.
Can you hear that, Mt Olive? Let's play it through.
Some it's a chance to check out original woodwork and turn-of-the-century style homes. But for others, it's a chance to discover an Omaha neighborhood that sometimes goes forgotten. Emily Zink has a sneak peek inside one of the homes that will be on display.
It actually was kind of a dream to get to live there. So it was a bit of a dream come true getting here.
Back in 2010, Tom Wood took a gamble, paying a mere $52,000 for a foreclosed 4,000 square foot home near 61st and Florence Boulevard. Wood saw the potential in both the neighborhood and the big brick home's old bones.
But the neat thing about it is that it was basically a blank canvas, which meant I could do whatever I wanted to do to it. So structurally, it was sound. It just needed a lot of work to bring it back to shape. You want to have some idea what it was like when I got it?
Yes.
On your hands.
Everything from the electrical to the windows had to be replaced in this century-old home. But Wood didn't view the remodel as a challenge. He saw it as a way to bring this old house and historic neighborhood back to life. Many, many decades ago, Florence Boulevard was referred to as Omaha's most beautiful mile. But today, many people don't even know this neighborhood exists. But on Sunday, you could come check out the beauty that still lives here.
I mean, this area used to be where the prominent people in Omaha lived. I mean, you have former mayor who lived here, a state senator who lived here, the inventor of Duncan Hines chocolate cake mix lived in this neighborhood. I mean, this has got such a rich history.
Christine Gerber, the executive director of Restoration Exchange, and her colleagues have made it their goal to introduce the community to hidden gems, just like the Florence Boulevard neighborhood, by putting on home tours.
We want to really, in essence, as part of our mission, is really educate and motivate people to bring these homes back to life.
8 different homes along Florence Boulevard will be on tour this Sunday from noon until 5 o'clock. Tom Wood's home will be one of them, and he wants to show the community that he and his neighbors are already ahead of the housing trend.
You got to remember that 50 years from now, those brand new neighborhoods in West Omaha are going to be 50, 60, 70 years old. They'll have their issues too. So, we're ahead of the game down here. We've already come back to the revival here.
Emily Zink, up front at 4. Tickets for the Florence Boulevard neighborhood tour.
Some of us went on that tour. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. And it lends itself to towards the end of this conversation today, because when we look at some of the preservation efforts that have happened on the boulevard, we run against a few, let's just call them rough edges. One of the preservation efforts came around in 2007. when historic preservationists for the state of Nebraska recommended the creation of the Florence Boulevard Residential Historic District. You can see here what the summary of the proposal looked like. It says that the proposed Florence Boulevard Residential Historic District is situated on the eastern edge of the survey area. You can see a mapping right there. Properties within the district are located on the boulevard, including a portion that extends west to Miller Park. Preliminary boundaries for the district include Kansas Avenue on the south, Newport Avenue on the north, and 24th Street on the west. However, the district boundaries are undetermined at this time and should be defined through future intensive survey efforts. Distinctive features of the district include the wide boulevard, similar setbacks, and the direct link to Miller Park. Homes in the district have a similar scale and reflect architectural styles popular during the early 20th centuries, including Craftsman and period revival styles. And while all of that is true, we all know that that sounds like a wonk wrote it because it doesn't really tell the whole story or even a majority of it. This is my dilemma with a lot of preservation efforts. They're done with really well-meaning intentions, but they don't take feet and they don't go anywhere. And as we all know right now, there is no Florence Boulevard Residential Historic District. But the other part that I'll take issue with is the usage of just that name, because this is clearly not all of Florence Boulevard. We know that the boulevard goes way south, all the way down to Cass Avenue. And if we're going to talk about Florence Boulevard, let's talk about the whole thing. Let's talk about the Mehmet Apartments. Let's talk about the Campion house that Creighton University destroyed. Let's bring it north and come all the way up to Kuntz Park, or talk about some of the beautiful homes that are further south, including the Trimble Castle and other places. There are a lot of beautiful places on Florence Boulevard. Or let's talk about the Prettiest Mile specifically. Now, notice that even the well-intentioned TV station got it wrong. The Prettiest Mile was never called Omaha's most beautiful mile. But I'm going to tell you a secret. People rely on the internet too much, because once upon a time, I made a bad graphic 15 years ago that I put on the internet. Now, I ended up fixing it and I labeled it correctly, but on that bad graphic, I called it Omaha's most beautiful mile instead of the prettiest mile. That's not that big of a deal, but it just shows you that people don't do the research. So we know that this proposal right here didn't do the research of getting in touch with actual people who live on the boulevard, who are passionate and care about it. But they also didn't talk about the stories from the boulevard. Now, nobody's going to tell the story about how my dad used to lead night hikes with me and my brother and his friends down into the swamps, down into that agricultural land on the bottom side of the cliff. Pastor Steve Eldridge used to be at Pearl Church, and Steve would let us cut through his yard in nighttime. And we'd all go back there, a group of 8 or 10 of us boys with my dad in the lead. And he'd take us down the cliffside and we'd stumble across these old brick pilings, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But we go down into that, what was once a forested area, and then cornfields. And if you've ever hung down there, you know that. There were some old barns that were down there in the 80s and 90s, all the way into the 2010s, honestly. Before the store's rugby field was put in, that area was more of a marsh than anything else. There's a hilarious scene in my memory, in my mind's eye, where one of my brother's friends who had never been in the nature before, this guy saw this piece of concrete showing underneath the moonlight, and he decided that he was going to walk across the concrete because he was tired of walking through the reeds. And my dad went to stop him, but decided to let him have his experience. And he looked out on this gray surface and he just went walking straight forward and right into the sheen of the pond that was underneath that gray surface because it was swampy. And he squished right into it up to his hips. This teenage kid who had never been in a swamp before, never been into the woods before, down there on the bottom side of the cliff behind the Prettiest Mile. Oh, we found those old barns. Remember I mentioned the fields that the farmers had, or the people who lived up on the boulevard? They had their gardens down there, and some of them had barns, Model A barns and farm barns, where they stored hay for their horses. Remember that Florence Boulevard was laid out in 1892, about a decade before cars became popular in Omaha. People kept their horses down in the paddocks behind the boulevard, down the cliff. So they'd have a barn down there. And at one point, there were more than a dozen barns down there. Now, you might be familiar with the barns at the top. A couple of the old houses still have the old stable behind their house. But a couple of the houses also have brick covered entryways in the cliff. And a lot of people have conjectured about those entryways. People will tell you stories of bootlegging that happened in the 1910s and 20s when Prohibition was underway in Nebraska. Some people will tell you that they were hideaways on the Underground Railroad in the long olden days. But I'm here to pop that bubble because that's one of the fun things that I get from the Florence Boulevard history. In reality, those were tunnels that were built from some of the oldest houses that connected the house down to their stables where their horses were kept, so that people didn't have to plod down the cliffside. They would go down the stairs into their own tunnel and take that tunnel out to their horses, hook up the buggy, and then take it out from there. Those tunnels weren't built to be bootlegging tunnels. They were too young to be connected to the Underground Railroad, which existed into the 1860s, 1865, 1867 was when the railroad officially ended. The houses didn't exist at that point. So all of the romance of those tunnels. Now, could that mean that none of them were used for bootlegging? Absolutely not. Because Tom Dennison did live on the boulevard and he was involved in the illicit movement of alcohol in Omaha during the Prohibition. But I can't confirm one way or the other, and the newspaper isn't telling any truth. I've looked through the Omaha World Herald and all of that era and found nothing to corroborate that those tunnels were used for bootlegging. So if you have oral history that you've heard, follow that lead, see if you can find something. But other preservation efforts on the boulevard, I think it's important to mention one particular. I called it the Florence Boulevard. I'm sorry, I called it the Fort Omaha House. One house on the boulevard was actually built in 1869 originally. 1869, Adam. That's long before the boulevard existed. Oh, remember that Winter Quarters Road was there from 1846, but this house was originally built over at Fort Omaha in 1869, when the first wooden houses were built at Fort Omaha. In 1900, a pair of brothers, the Grenville brothers, they had a greenhouse operation on the boulevard. They moved the house, they bought it from the U.S. Army and moved it over to the boulevard, to the east side. Recently, in the last several years, a man named Tim Reeder bought that house and has renovated it. Now he's calling it the Omaha History Farm. You can learn all about that online in other places, but it's another preservation effort on the boulevard that should be mentioned. You guys might know of other efforts. Restoration Exchange Omaha has come and gone, and that organization doesn't exist anymore. There's another organization in its place, but it's not really focused on the boulevard much. But maybe somebody will do a historic tour. Maybe there will be a Prettiest Mile historic district at some point. All of that's for the future. In the meantime, let's come back to this slide. Remember the Rome Miller's house? Here you go. Here's a view of it from the distance. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask about the Prettiest Mile in Omaha? One of the slides that I left out, you can absolutely call me Mt Olive, but let me give you a number to call that will get you right to me. Here, I'll put it in the chat. It's 403. Whoops. 598 5484. So here we go. I wonder if I'm going to echo. Oh, I am. Just a minute. Here, let me mute the Zoom.
I don't know why someone could ask you questions.
Go for it. Horseshoe Bend. So Horseshoe Bend is also called, I wonder if you can mute me on your end on the, it's getting feedback. Anyway, does that work? Oh, no, that's right. That's right. What if I'm here, wait, I think I figured it.